Now that you're familiar with the Federal Reserve's objectives and how those objectives have changed over time, you're obviously and no doubt curious about, well, how does the Fed go about meeting its objectives? Well, keep this in mind. The Fed's objectives are realized with the Fed's influence upon borrowing. The Fed influences borrowing and spending with its impact on interest rates. Rising rates, borrowing and spending are difficult. Falling rates, borrowing and spending are easy. How does the Federal Reserve accomplish this? The Federal Reserve accomplishes this by providing the banking system with more or less reserves. If the banks have more reserves, they can lend more, and that will tend to make credit conditions easy. Borrowing is easier because interest rates generally are lower. If the Federal Reserve pursues contractionary, restrictive policies, what the Fed does is restrict the growth of reserves. The banks can't lend as much, and that would tend to boost interest rates up. Well, how does the Fed do this? It's quite simple. What the Federal Reserve does is step into the marketplace and buy something by writing a check on itself. And so when the Federal Reserve writes a check on itself and pays for what it has purchased, the seller of those goods deposits the check in his or her bank, and when that bank takes that check written by the Federal Reserve on itself to the Federal Reserve and asks for payment, the Federal Reserve pays the bank by crediting that bank's reserves. The reserves rise. Well, you might ask yourself, well, what on earth does the Federal Reserve buy? Well, the Federal Reserve could buy anything. It could buy automobiles. But the Fed doesn't want to go into the market and influence a variety of markets by its own purchases. I mean, if it went out and bought automobiles, it would need the world's biggest garage to store them all. So what the Federal Reserve does, it goes into the market and buys United States Treasury securities. Now, don't be thrown off track by this. Just because the Federal Reserve buys United States Treasury securities doesn't mean there's a connection between the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury. The United States Treasury, agency of the federal government. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation owned by the nation's banks, but with public control. So, because the Federal Reserve buys United States Treasury securities, don't think that that means there's a connection between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Back to our story. If the Federal Reserve goes out into the market and buys those United States Treasury securities from a securities dealer, you can very well imagine what happens next. The securities dealer has a check from the Federal Reserve, written by the Federal Reserve on itself. The dealer goes to his or her bank, deposits the check. The bank then takes that check, says to the Federal Reserve, please pay. The Federal Reserve pays the bank by crediting the bank's reserve account at the Federal Reserve. And that's the way the Federal Reserve can provide the banks with more reserves, and that makes it easier for the banks to lend. And if it's easier for the banks to lend, well, you can imagine interest rates will fall. That's easy. You might say, well, how does the Federal Reserve pursue the opposite policy? The Federal Reserve can pursue the opposite policy really just by doing nothing at all. Because over time, if the economy is going to grow, and if there's going to be more borrowing and spending, well then, of course, the Federal Reserve, if it just sits back and does not provide the banks with more reserves, then the situation becomes tight and strained for the banks, increasingly just with the passage of time because they don't have more reserves with which to conduct their business. But you could also imagine that if the Fed really wanted to tighten up in a hurry, what the Federal Reserve could do then is take some securities out of its inventory of securities it's purchased, sell them to a securities dealer. That securities dealer pays with a check written on the dealer's bank, and when the Federal Reserve takes that check to the dealer's bank, it collects from the dealer's bank by reducing that bank's reserve account. So the Federal Reserve can force bank reserves down, or it can build them up. And either way, as you can imagine, that's going to affect interest rates throughout the economy. More reserves, it's easier for the banks to lend. That tends to send interest rates out. Less reserve, it's tougher for the banks to lend. It tends to boost reserves up. Now, you might say, well, on what does the Federal Reserve base its decisions? You can keep track of that in a number of ways, and as you read on in the module, you will see that periodically the Federal Reserve issues a publication called the Beige Book, just like the color beige, the Beige Book, the color of the book, and that describes credit conditions and economic conditions throughout the economy, region by region and overall. And by going to the Federal Reserve's website, you can read the Fed's Beige Book, and you can get an up-to-the-minute assessment of where the Federal Reserve thinks the economy is now as it plans to either supply the banks with reserves or restrict the growth of reserves. Now, the record of interest rates and the basic connection of two interest rates, we'll look at that in greater detail as we move along.